Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of June. Today's speaker is Noah Chafets, and Noah's title is Funeral Games in the Iliad. This first Friday lecture is supported by the Anastopoulos Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anastopoulos. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel later if you want to watch it. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during this presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type in the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Noah at the end of his lecture during the question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Noah and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. Noah's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way for you to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program until the end of this month, when my second term ends. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. You can find links to more information in the chat box. The Basic Program is a 4-year non-credit certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle of direct engagement with original thinkers in their original texts. Through focused discussion and close reading, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western traditions in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Registration is now open for September term and for autumn quarter courses. Our next First Friday lecture will happen September 6th, when our speaker will be me, Kendall Sharp, and my title will be Introducing Ancient India Through the Rig Veda and the Upanishads. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Noah Chafets joined the Basic Program instructional staff in 2020. He holds a BA in philosophy from Vassar College and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought. He taught high school students in Boston and Shanghai and taught undergraduates here at the university, primarily in course sequences in the humanities and social sciences, for a decade before joining the Basic Program. Noah's interests are well represented by the texts in the Basic Program curriculum, but also extend to contemporary ethics and practical philosophy, aesthetics, and film. And as of July 1, Noah will be the new Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Noah.
All right, thanks very much, Kendall. Let me share my screen. Bear with me just a moment. Okay, I think we are ready to go so long as I move all this Zoom junk out of the way of my text. All right. Well, thanks for being here, everyone. As you can see, the talk I'm going to give you today is called Funeral Games in the Iliad. Now and then I find myself faced with the question of what a great book is. This tends to happen when I need to explain the kinds of courses that I teach, or to decide whether a particular text belongs in them, or when I find myself wondering, say, what the Republic has in common with Middlemarch, or what Newton's Principia has in common with the Book of Genesis. I'm sure that it's worthwhile to try to say what a great book is, and that a number of different formulations are useful, even if it's wise not to cling too tightly to any one of them. As with most definitional questions, it's natural to approach this one by fastening on the clearest examples available, so that we can investigate what makes them so clear. The Iliad is just such an example. If it isn't a great book, then I have no idea what a great book is or how to go about identifying one. Before I ever taught it, I probably would have told you with some conviction that the Iliad is a great book. Although, if you were someone I could speak to in confidence, I might have added that it wasn't my favorite book in the world, that the Odyssey seemed more lively to me, and that poetry loses so much in translation anyway. But one mark of a great book is that it deepens as one gets to know it better. And over the years, I've gotten to know the Iliad far better than I once did. I had to teach it 3 times before I was at all satisfied with my discussion questions about it. In more recent years, as my stock of questions has begun to settle, every group of students finds new ways to answer them, and their thoughts never fail to make the poem stranger and more beautiful for me. Today, I'm going to offer you a small sample demonstration of why I've come to think that the Iliad is so clearly a great book. I'm going to do so by focusing on a passage that I love to put before groups of students and that, at first, tends to strike them as curiously out of place. This is the depiction of the funeral games for Patroclus, which occupies roughly the final 2/3 of Book 23, the next to last book of the Iliad. The funeral games are the final stage of Patroclus' funeral. They follow upon a procession of myrmidons in their chariots, singing dirges, a night of feasting, a second procession the following day, which conveys Patroclus' body to an enormous funeral pyre, to which Achilles contributes the bodies of sheep and cattle, 4 horses, 2 dogs that Patroclus fed at his table, and 12 Trojan captives. Then the burning of the pyre, the heaping of a barrow, and the collection of Patroclus' bones. These will be set aside in order to fulfill the final request that Patroclus' ghost has addressed to Achilles, that the 2 friends' bones be held in the same urn. Achilles presides over all these arrangements with a grief that seems as if it cannot be contained or appeased, like the rage that has driven him to slaughter droves of Trojans, to reject Hector's proposal that they fight on terms, and, after taking his revenge, to bear Hector's body to the Greek camp by dragging it behind his chariot. This is the background for one of the great puzzles of the funeral games, in which the mood of the narrative shifts dramatically. The events of Book 23 are all grief and solemnity before the opening line, from the opening line through the building of Patroclus' tomb. But the games, which follow immediately, are lively and celebratory, full of the kinds of things we might witness at any great athletic spectacle. Competitors and onlookers absorbed in the events, feats of strength, speed, and skill, fierce striving for glory, elation and frustration shared by athletes and their partisans. Prizes are awarded to all who compete, and Achilles gives extra to some of whom he believes deserves more than what he's allotted for each event. Although disputes arise between drivers in the chariot race and between 2 spectators, these are settled without any lasting rancor. Several characters boast, but they also praise and defer to one another. The injuries sustained in the games are all superficial. There are several moments of serious danger, but they pass without incident, under the careful watch of the crowd, the umpire, and, most notably, Achilles himself. More than a competent referee and master of ceremonies, Achilles performs his role with impressive tact, and political astuteness. And he is magnanimous, even-tempered, and generous throughout. This is hardly the Achilles of the last 22 books, nor does it seem to be the Achilles of Book 24, certainly not at first. Achilles mentions Patroclus only in passing during the funeral games, 4 times in roughly 600 lines, and he otherwise busies himself with orchestrating the athletic events and awarding prizes. Book 23 ends on a high note, with Achilles giving Agamemnon first prize in the spear-throwing event as soon as Agamemnon has risen to take part in it. More on that later. You might contrast this with the opening lines of Book 24. The games were over now, the gathered armies scattered, each man to his fast ship, and fighters turned their minds to thoughts of food and the sweet warm grip of sleep. But Achilles kept on grieving for his friend, the memory burning on, and all subduing sleep could not take him. Not now. He turned and twisted, side to side. He longed for Patroclus' manhood, his gallant heart. What rough campaigns they had fought to an end together. What hardships they had suffered, cleaving their way through wars of men and pounding waves at sea. The memories flooded over him, live tears flowing. And now he'd lie on his side, now flat on his back, now face down again. At last he'd leap to his feet, wander in anguish, aimless along the surf, and dawn on dawn, flaming over the sea and shore, would find him pacing. Then he'd yoke his racing team to the chariot harness, lash the corpse of Hector behind the car for dragging, and haul him 3 times round the dead Patroclus tomb. And then he'd rest again in his tents and leave the body sprawled face down in the dust. Why are the funeral games so different in tone from the surrounding episodes in the narrative? How should we account for the apparent anomalies in Achilles' behavior and demeanor in this section? Further, why might Homer have devoted so many richly detailed lines of the Iliad to these games? And why might he have done so at this point in the poem in particular? We might add one last question that's liable to strike us as especially urgent, given our cultural distance from the Iliad. Why would anyone play sports at a funeral? To these last 3 questions, one answer that I've heard proposed a few times over the years is that the funeral games are customary. There is good evidence for this answer, even within Homer. In Book 23, we encounter mentions of funeral games in the past for 2 nobles in Greece, Amarynceus and Oedipus. In Book 22, Homer compares Hector and Achilles racing for Hector's life to 2 horses who might race in order to honor a dead man. And in Book 24 of the Odyssey, the shade of Agamemnon in the underworld mentions funeral games held for Achilles himself after his death. By the late Archaic period, which ended around 500 BC, funeral games had given way to civic games, like the ones that took place at the famous Pan-Hellenic festivals at Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and the Isthmus of Corinth. But the little evidence we have suggests that while they lasted, funeral games were conducted to honor dead warriors, maybe exclusively when they had died in battle. So this answer, that funeral games were customary, is only a starting point, however. It explains why it might have been possible for Homer, or the tradition on which he drew, to include the funeral games for Patroclus in the poem, whereas it would not have been possible for, say, Thomas Malory to have depicted funeral games held to honor King Arthur. But it doesn't explain why Homer chose to include the games in the Iliad, why he included them at this point, why he portrayed them at such length and in such detail, or what the meaning of the games is within the poem. Another answer that I'd like to acknowledge at this point is that the funeral games are fun. Readers or listeners of the Iliad might have gotten the kind of thrill from this section of the poem that a devoted fan might get from listening to a World Series game called by an outstandingly gifted radio announcer. This also strikes me as an insightful explanation of what the funeral games are doing in the Iliad. But it does very little to answer the handful of big questions that I've just posed. I'm convinced we can do better, and I will try now to convince those of you who also need convincing. It's striking that all 8 athletic events at the funeral games either consist in or derive from activities of war. These events are chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, racing on foot, fighting in armor, hurling a mass of iron, archery, and spear throwing. Aside from boxing and wrestling, at various points in the Iliad, the performance of all of these activities in battle are matters of life and death. Whoops, looks like we got some drawing on the screen. Let's see. Kendall or Zoe, I might not need an assist to disable this.
I'll see if I can fix it.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I'm gonna keep going. I think that drawing is probably not too disruptive to all of you. Sorry about that, everybody. So where was I? Okay, I'm gonna go back to the beginning of that last sentence. Aside from boxing and wrestling, At various points in the Iliad, the performance of all these games in battle are matters of life and death. Whereas in the most dangerous of the funeral games, the fighting in armor, the spectators intervene when they fear that Diomedes might actually pierce Ajax's throat with his spear. This moment seems to emphasize both that the games resemble activities of war, and that in the games, unlike in the war, lives are not at stake. This points to a handful of more satisfying answers to some of the questions that I posed. The funeral games are an occasion for the Greeks to test themselves in the activities of war, to exercise and exhibit their fighting capacities, to compete for some of the goods that they might win on the battlefield, glory, honor, fame, and material gain, but without the most serious risks that they face in battle. If it seems strange to us to play sports at a funeral, we might close some of the cultural distance by likening this to making music at funerals, as characters in the Iliad also do. Although there are, of course, important differences between the two activities, both are live performances of highly refined bodily skills, which produce nothing beyond the performance itself. Both may involve displays of excellence and great coordination between performers, and both are beautiful when well done. Whereas the war pits one extended political community against another, the games take place within a single community. They are a spectacle of something quite like war for men who, although they've been fighting for nearly 10 years, have little opportunity to observe the activities of war in a peaceful setting, and who seem too fully immersed in the fighting to regard the phenomena of war as aesthetic and intellectual objects in the way that the poem allows its audience to do. And the games serve as a peaceful outlet for some of the impulses that animate the war. Insofar as we find these features of the funeral games in games of all kinds, this scene invites us to think about the relationship between war and games in general. Let me turn back to the fighting in armor. This event resembles nothing in the Iliad so closely as the two duels, which open and close the first day of battle. Paris challenges Menelaus to the first duel in Book 3, and Hector proposes the terms. The two men will fight to the death for Helen and all her wealth, and the rest of the Trojans and Greeks will end the war with pacts of friendship. Agamemnon adds that if Menelaus defeats Paris, the Trojans will make a hefty payment to the Greeks by way of reparation. Agamemnon and Priam swear oaths to abide by these terms, and soldiers from both armies, hopeful that this will bring an end to the war in its 10th year, pray to Zeus for the death of whoever brought the war on both countries, and for the harshest punishments to be visited on anyone who violates the treaty. But Zeus won't allow for this minimally bloody resolution to the war. Although the ensuing combat is entirely one-sided, when Menelaus is about to land a killing blow, Aphrodite rescues Paris and deposits him unharmed in his bedchamber. In the ensuing confusion, Athena incites the Trojan Pandarus to shoot an arrow at Menelaus, and she ensures that it wounds him only superficially. This is a violation of the truce, and it gives rise to general fighting between the armies. This fighting is interrupted by Hector in Book 7, when he calls another truce and challenges any Greek willing to face him in single combat. This isn't an action that Hector conceives independently. Apollo proposes it to Athena, who transmits the idea to Hector's prophetic brother, Helenus, and Helenus relays it to Hector. The terms that Hector offers the Greeks are very similar to the terms that he offers Achilles, and that Achilles rejects before he kills Hector in Book 22. That the winner strip the arms of the loser, but return his body to his people. Among the Greeks who accept Hector's challenge, Ajax's lot is drawn. His fight with Hector is intense, but Ajax gets the better of it. Apollo intervenes to set Hector back on his feet after Ajax has struck him with a boulder, and before the two men can fight with their swords, one Greek and one Trojan herald get between them, reassuring them that Zeus loves them both, and that everyone present knows they are both great warriors, better to break off before nightfall than to kill one another. Ajax insists that Hector call an end to the combat because he has proposed it. Hector obliges and initiates an exchange of gifts with Ajax. There are telling similarities and differences between the two duels, and between each of them and the fighting in armor at the funeral games. Nobody dies in any of these scenes, but there is an expectation or a possibility of death in all of them. In all three cases, however, the fighting takes place against the backdrop of a set of conventions and agreements, and nearby, among the spectators, are parties ready to intervene. In these respects, the three instances of single combat stand out from the fighting within the war, which is largely unstructured by conventions or agreements, and in which the spectating gods intervene only sporadically. The first duel is initiated by Paris, and the terms make it far more consequential than any single action in battle, insofar as the victory of either Paris or Menelaus would bring an immediate end to the war. Perhaps because the object of this duel, the total resolution of the war, is so widely desired, and because the means that it presents are so humane relative to the alternative, all human efforts in this case aim to ensure the death of one combatant or the other, and Greek and Trojan soldiers alike pray for a lethal outcome. But for the same reasons that the humans desire this outcome, Zeus will not allow it. Aphrodite intervenes twice to save Paris' life, and Athena incites Pandarus to violate the truce. All of this ensures that the conflict between Paris and Menelaus will not be resolved by way of human convention. Only the destruction of Troy will do. The second duel is initiated by Apollo, and although he also picks Hector up off the ground, the fight is disrupted by human beings, Greek and Trojan heralds, and Hector and Ajax ultimately agree to call it off. By contrast, there is no divine agency involved in the fighting in armor at the funeral games. Achilles arranges for this event. When Diomedes' spear comes perilously close to Ajax's throat, Greek spectators stop the fight and call for the men to share the prizes. Achilles defies this call and gives the prize for victory to Diomedes. This isn't to say that the gods play no role in the funeral games. Although relative to their involvement in the two duels and in the war, their role in the games is far more limited. Apollo knocks the whip out of Diomedes' hand when he's about to overtake Menelaus in the home stretch of the Chariot-Race. Athena restores the whip to Diomedes, breaks the yoke-holding Menelaus' horses, and thereby wrecks his chariot, which leaves Diomedes the race's clear winner. And it seems that the same two gods answer prayers in later events. Athena responds to a prayer from Odysseus in the foot race by filling him with strength and tripping the smaller Ajax, son of Oileus, in cow manure, so that Odysseus can take first prize. Likewise, in the archery event, because he neglects to pray to Apollo, Teucer misses the dove, serving as a target, and instead hits the tether around its leg. Meriones then promises a sacrifice to Apollo and shoots the fleeing dove out of the sky. The smaller Ajax complains that Athena has meddled in the foot race. And we might grant that he has a point, whether because this kind of interference is unjust, because it tarnishes the spectacle of the games, or because it renders them an impure test of the athlete's abilities. But this response leaves some important considerations out of account. Factors of chance contribute to the outcome of every athletic contest. One athlete is taller than another, has sharper eyes or a faster metabolism, has had better food or training, keeps her footing, or has the wind at her back at the crucial moment. However disenchanted, the outcome of no athletic contest, and likewise no battle, reflects the competitor's merits and efforts alone. There's also Homer's report that Teucer has made an error in neglecting to pray to Apollo before he shoots at the dove, which suggests that within the world of the Iliad, part of an athlete's work consists in seeking a god's assistance where appropriate. Teucer's oversight makes him a worse archer, and the outcome of the event reflects his practical failure. More importantly, for my purposes, Apollo and Athena intervene only in the physical mechanics of the athlete's actions, not in their thinking or willing, or in the actions of Achilles or the other spectators. This leaves all decisions about how to arrange and judge the athletic events and how to settle disputes over them up to the Greeks themselves. The two primary means by which men in the Iliad demonstrate their merit are by fighting in battle and by doing the kinds of things that one does at an assembly, or what I will call political activity, commanding, judging, and deliberating. If the events of the funeral games serve as tests of the competitors' martial abilities, then in the commands, judgments, and deliberations that surround these events, the Greeks exercise their character and their capacities as political actors. As I've mentioned, lives are not at stake here. If not for the conventions that structure the games, there would effectively be no reason for any of the Greeks to care whose chariot crossed an arbitrary line first, or which man shot a dove and which shot its tether. But the conventions bring along with them stakes that are no less real because they are lower. Not life and death, as on the battlefield, but success and failure, glory and disgrace, honor and dishonor, gain and loss, or at least lost opportunity for gain, and for the more dangerous events, health and injury. Although the events at the funeral games resemble activities of war, competing in them is clearly distinct from fighting in the war. It can usefully be characterized as a kind of playing at war. But in the commanding, judging, and deliberating that surround the games, the characters are not just playing politics, they are actually doing politics. Consider Achilles' part in the aftermath of the chariot race. He says that Eumelus has wrecked and finished last despite being the best man. So if Diomedes must be given the first prize, Eumelus should take the second prize. This is an attempt at corrective justice, which seems to be motivated by at least two intuitions: that the outcome of the race should carry the greatest weight in the assignment of prizes, but that prizes should also be assigned in accordance with merit. With this judgment, Achilles tries to correct for what we might consider the interference of Apollo and Athena, for factors that are exogenous to the performance of the athletes, but that radically shape the outcome of the chariot race, by awarding the best prize available to the best man among the drivers. Antilochus protests Achilles' judgment, saying that if he wants to, Achilles can draw on his great store of wealth to offer some other prize for Eumelus, but that he, Antilochus, has won second prize by crossing the finish line next after Diomedes. If another man wants to deprive him of this prize, he won't get it without a fight. Achilles responds warmly to Antilochus, agreeing to fetch a new gift for Eumelus and let Antilochus keep second prize. But this dispute immediately gives way to another. For Antilochus has managed to place second only by way of some aggressive maneuvering. As they raced side by side and their chariots approached a narrow point in the track, Antilochus ignored Menelaus' warnings and effectively forced him into a game of chicken in which Menelaus had to choose between wrecking both cars and allowing Antilochus to pass him. Out of prudence, he yielded to Antilochus and placed third to Antilochus' second. But Antilochus' impassioned assertion that second prize is his is too much for Menelaus to bear. Furious, Menelaus rebukes the younger man for recklessness and impudence. His mind reeling, Menelaus at first asks for impartial judgment from the Greek leaders, but then thinks better and demands that Antilochus himself settle the matter by swearing an oath that he didn't deliberately force Menelaus to yield by underhanded means. This is all too much for Antilochus. He responds that he's unwilling to lose favor with Menelaus or swear a false oath, so he apologizes, pleading his youth as an excuse for his behavior and declaring that he is the lesser man. Menelaus' fury melts at this. He admonishes Antilochus to be more careful next time and not to cheat his superiors, but he recognizes the service that Antilochus and his father Nestor have done him in the war and assures Antilochus of the goodwill that he bears him, allowing the younger man to keep the prize that he has won by questionable means. And because Achilles has already awarded a more substantial prize to Eumelus, he gives the unclaimed fifth prize to Nestor, saying that although Nestor can no longer compete because of his age, he should accept the prize as a memorial to Patroclus' funeral. Excuse me. The course of none of sorry about that. The course of none of the disputes, negotiations, or decisions regarding these prizes for the chariot race is dictated entirely by prior rules or conventions. After the race ends, neither Achilles nor Menelaus believes that, considered by itself, the order in which the drivers have crossed the finish line can determine how the prizes should be allocated, as it would have if the race had proceeded in a more straightforward manner. Antilochus rejects Achilles' proposed solution, and he eventually gets his way only after apologizing to Menelaus. None of the moves that these characters make are arbitrary, as all three offer explanations and invoke principles to justify their various actions and positions in the exchange. But they have to reason aloud in this way because they're improvising in the face of a breakdown of regular order, and there will be no resolution unless they can bring one another along. All of this activity is political activity. It must be meaningful that the funeral games are the centerpiece of the last public meeting of the Greeks in the Iliad, and the last time that we will see any of the Greeks, aside from Achilles and a handful of myrmidons who serve him in his tent. Achilles has unfinished business by the end of the games. We've seen how in Book 24 he continues to grieve violently for Patroclus dragging Hector's body around his tomb. And of course, Achilles must be brought around to return Hector's body to Priam. But the long arc of Achilles' relationship with Agamemnon, the Greek kings, and the army effectively ends with the funeral games. Why might this be? The exchanges between Achilles, Antilochus, Menelaus, and Nestor after the chariot race suggest one possible answer. For in all of them, we can find connections to the conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles that erupted in Book 1, and that shapes the course of all events in the poem that follow it. In Book 1, Agamemnon learns that he must return Chryseis to her father, Chryses, the priest of Apollo, and provide a large offering to the god to atone for rejecting Chryses' ransom for his daughter and for chasing Chryses away with mortal threats. This is the only thing that will lift Apollo's plague, which is killing the Greeks and their animals. Agamemnon is willing, but he insists that the Greeks compensate him for the loss, claiming that it wouldn't be fitting for him alone to go without a prize of war. Achilles challenges Agamemnon on this point. He says that there is no excess plunder that hasn't been distributed, but that Agamemnon will be more than compensated after they sack Troy. Agamemnon digs in. He won't be cheated by Achilles. If he is refused, they'll confiscate one of the Greek commander's captive women, perhaps even Achilles' own. Achilles then turns to insults. He flings Agamemnon's greed in his face, saying that he takes the largest share of the war prizes that others win in battle, fighting for him. Achilles then threatens to sail home rather than continue to fight under such a commander. Agamemnon tells him to go right ahead, but he promises to seize Briseis, Achilles' captive, so that Achilles can learn that Agamemnon is the greater man, and so that no other Greek will challenge him as Achilles has done. At this point, Achilles moves to strike Agamemnon down in the assembly, and he's restrained from doing so only by Athena. Soon afterward, Thetis relays Achilles' prayer to Zeus that the Greeks suffer a series of bloody defeats. This lays the ground for the Trojans to push the Greeks right up against their ships, for Patroclus to stave off a massacre by driving the Trojans back, only to be killed himself, for Achilles' reconciliation with Agamemnon in an elaborate ceremony, which, as he makes abundantly clear to all present, Achilles only tolerates so that he can take his revenge for Patroclus, knowing that his own death will follow soon afterward. Now consider the points of contact between these events and the ones that surround the chariot race. When Achilles tries to award second prize to Eumelus, he's moved by the intuition that it isn't fitting for the best man to go without a prize that befits his stature. He may not know that Eumelus has been denied his chance at first or second prize by the actions of Apollo and Athena, and he may not see the parallel with Agamemnon, whom Apollo compelled to return Chryseis to her father. It's also possible that Achilles doesn't realize how much his justification for awarding second prize to Eumelus on the grounds that he's the best man resembles Agamemnon's reasoning in Book 1, where he declares that he will give up Chryseis, but that it wouldn't be fitting for him, the best of the Achaeans, to be stripped of a war prize without due compensation. Threatened with the loss of his own prize, Antilochus responds to Achilles in a manner that recalls Achilles' response to Agamemnon. He's ready to resort to violence in order to defend his prize, which he claims to have won through his own sweat and toil in the chariot race, just as Achilles claims to have won Briseis through his own sweat and toil in battle, and tries to kill Agamemnon for confiscating her. But whereas Achilles escalated the conflict in Book 1 when he denied that the Greeks had any excess spoils of war with which to compensate Agamemnon for his loss, he de-escalates the conflict in Book 23 by retrieving a fresh prize for Eumelus. In this way, Achilles offers material recognition of one man's superiority without denying the second man's claim to the prize he has won in the race, precisely the kind of solution that eluded him in Book 1. Given the elaborate parallels between these two scenes, how should we account for the differences between the ways that Achilles behaves in each of them? Is it that Achilles has excess treasure to share as prizes at the funeral games, whereas he genuinely believed there was nothing left with which to compensate Agamemnon in Book 1? Is it that the games are designed to be an occasion for distributing material goods in honor of Patroclus and the competitors, such that it seems fitting to Achilles to offer a new prize to Eumelus, whereas it offended him to hand over a war prize to Agamemnon? Is it that Achilles' role in presiding over the games means that his own stature is not at stake in this scene, whereas in Book 1, he felt himself to be more like a competitor, and he lost himself in competing with Agamemnon? Is it that just as Achilles is a spectator to the athletic events, so he achieves something like a spectator's distance from the management of the games, such that he can practice politics here with the disinterested and sober judgment of a person with nothing directly at stake in them? Is it that something fundamental has shifted in Achilles over the course of the Iliad, such that he can now do for Eumelus and Antilochus what it once offended him to do for Agamemnon? Are the funeral games perhaps the occasion for him to achieve this transformation? As I read it, the poem neither allows us to choose between these interpretations nor forces us to do so. It only sets up the parallels and leaves us to make of them what we can. It also may be that Achilles sees himself in Antilochus, with his aggressive chariot racing in defiance of Menelaus' warnings, and with his fierce insistence that second prize is his. This may explain why Achilles allows Antilochus to keep the prize, and why, after Antilochus finishes last in the foot race and says that it would be hard for anyone but Achilles to have beaten Odysseus, Achilles gives him an extra half bar of gold as a reward. If this is right, then Achilles might also think of his conflict with Agamemnon when he sees Antilochus apologize to Menelaus, and Menelaus forgive the young man and let him keep second prize. The parallel to Book 1 here is a bit looser, in that Agamemnon bears greater responsibility for his loss of Chryseis than Menelaus bears for his loss of second prize in the race, and in that Agamemnon ultimately takes away a war captive, Briseis, who has been apportioned to Achilles as a prize, whereas the prize at issue between Antilochus and Menelaus is one that Menelaus claims as his own by right. Nevertheless, one can imagine Achilles, and perhaps Agamemnon, looking on with a mixture of approval and regret as Antilochus submits to Menelaus in recognition of his superiority, and as Menelaus forgives the younger, brasher Antilochus with a mild warning, allowing him to keep the prize he has claimed. There is one more distinct connection to Book 1 in the final moment of the funeral games. When Achilles sets out prizes for the spear throw, Agamemnon and Meriones rise to compete. But Achilles doesn't allow the event to go forward. Just as he has claimed before the first event, the Chariot-Race, that if his horses weren't mourning for Patroclus, he would surely take first prize himself, so Achilles declares before the final event, the spear throw, that the Greeks know how much Agamemnon exceeds them all in strength, and that he is the best among them, He proposes to award first prize to Agamemnon without having a single spear thrown, and Agamemnon accepts the prize with pleasure. In Book 1, Achilles undermined Agamemnon's status as commander of the army and accused him of claiming an outsized share of the war prizes that he never earned by fighting, a claim that, as we come to see, is clearly exaggerated. In Book 23, Achilles revisits this challenge and offers a corrective by exaggerating in the opposite direction. Everyone present knows that although Agamemnon is the best of the Greeks by rank, he is surely not the strongest of them. Achilles is. This is surely one of the reasons that Achilles' defiance of Agamemnon in Book 1 could spiral so disastrously. Agamemnon is superior by virtue of his position alone, not his merit. So a challenge from the finest Greek warrior leaves his claim to preeminence uncertain, and this challenge cannot go unanswered. This is also likely why the other gods never attempt to subvert Zeus's will by means of a direct confrontation, and why Hector never faces serious insubordination within the Trojan army. Both of these figures combine recognized authority within their spheres with physical force that can't be matched by any possible challengers. It's also why the ill-shaped Thersites' abuse of Agamemnon in Book 2 could be addressed promptly and definitively with a thrashing from Odysseus. Because there's nothing impressive about Thersites, his challenge does nothing to expose the fact that in Agamemnon, the right to rule is not combined with superior personal qualities. In awarding Agamemnon first prize in the spear throw, Achilles fortifies Agamemnon's authority not only by publicly endorsing the fiction that Agamemnon is the strongest of the Greeks, but by reducing the athletic event to pure ceremony, and thereby placing Agamemnon's strength beyond the reach of a live test. This gesture might strike us as undermining. If Agamemnon's claim to strength can't be risked in the spear-throwing event, it seems a fragile one. If this claim is meant to provide implicit support for Agamemnon's claim to rule, so much the worse. But wherever much depends on the stability of political authority and chain of command, there is also wisdom in not pitting leaders against their subordinates in public contests that the leaders might lose. Achilles ran afoul of this principle in Book 1, and it has cost him everything. By the end of Book 23, he has absorbed the lesson. This is why, in his final interaction with Agamemnon, Achilles stages a game that is no game at all. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Noah. Where am I? All righty, let's see here. We have some questions, and let me announce to the audience. Please type your questions for Noah in the chat, and I will add them to the list. Let's see. Taking the questions in reverse order. Let's see. Elizabeth Raymond asks. Critics like Auerbach don't think that characters like Achilles develop or grow in the Iliad. Do books 23 and 24 run counter to this view?
I think they do. Thanks for the question, Libby. Yeah, I mean, far be it from me to come down all that definitively on one reading of the Iliad. As I mentioned, I think there are lots of ways to read it. This is one of what makes it one of the things that makes it a great book. It is just so rich. Auerbach is a fantastic commentator on the Iliad. I've learned lots by reading him, but I tend to lean the other direction on this point.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. Charles Fout asks, did the ancient Greeks in general faithfully accept the mythical gods? How were the beliefs promulgated? Some sort of theogony catechism?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, so both good questions. So I will say something that Charles and I are about to start reading the Meno together, and I'm sure I'll say a version of this. when we start that course. I tend to say whenever somebody asks anything about the Greeks, there is no one thing that it's possible to say about the Greeks with any great confidence. They were highly diverse. The people we call the ancient Greeks, we're talking about at least 1,000 years of history. They come from different cultures. They live in different places. They don't resemble one another a huge amount internally. It's a bit like asking, a question about the Americans. So did the Greeks, the questions were, remind me, Kendall, one, did the Greeks believe in the ancient, in the Greek gods, and how were beliefs about the gods propagated through a kind of standard catechism? Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. So some did, some didn't, is the answer to the first question. Some believed in the Greek gods traditionally, some didn't. There was a huge amount of variation in the tradition from place to place, and a huge amount of variation in the sources we have that survive regarding that report opinions of individual authors or the people that they're talking about. So very, very difficult to say any one thing about that. It's also really hard to say any one thing about how these beliefs were propagated. I can say that, a lot of stories about gods have some kind of rooting in Homer, which is to say that poets and other kinds of writers and future ages, as well as priests and keepers of more local traditions, would riff in one way or another on the picture of the gods that you saw in Homer. You find departures here and there, but you also find points of continuity. So it was a growing, evolving tradition with likewise evolving and internally diverse means of propagating various beliefs about the gods.
Thank you, Noah, and thank you, Charles, for your question. The next question comes from Kurt Hines, who asks, well, why do you think the gods are depicted as caring about the outcome of certain games? Did the Greeks believe good or bad luck must be the result of divine intervention?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure what the Greeks believe. I'm going to say something similar. I'm guessing you asked that question. This is a question from Kurt, yeah. Before I answer that last question, because of the way that these questions pop up in the text. But so I'm not sure that there's any one thing that the Greeks in general or the Greeks within the poem believe about chance events. It seems like there are such things as chance events in which the gods don't intervene. You'd have to really go through the poem one instance at a time to figure out which ones are which and what various characters think about them. But there you go. I suspect that there's variety to be found. And then why do the gods, in this case, Apollo and Athena, care about the outcomes of the various athletic events? I mean, I think that there are some indications within the text about this. Apollo seems to be sore about Diomedes, the little rampage he goes on in book 6, in which he attacks Aphrodite and Ares, who are defenders of the Trojans, with Athena's help. He also has a run-in with Apollo in that book, I believe. So it could be that Apollo is out for revenge, or for either against Athena or against Diomedes or against both of them, when he knocks the whip out of Diomedes' hand during the chariot race. And it seems like Athena restores the whip and wrecks Eumelus because Diomedes is one of her favorites. I came across a reading in the secondary literature that all she's trying to do is ensure that there's an outcome for Diomedes that he would have achieved had Apollo not meddled in the first place. It's an interesting thought. So that might be one reason why she cares about the chariot race. In the other cases, I think you can explain Athena's intervention in the foot race, where she trips up the little Ajax and puts some vigor into Odysseus's legs, because she is also a patron of Odysseus. And in the archery, the prayers that is addressed to Apollo by Meriones, I think is one that Apollo cares about. First of all, because he's having a prayer addressed to him with a promise of a future sacrifice, and second of all, because he is the patron god of archery, among other things, or one of two, and so he gets involved because of that. But I think that this question, why do the gods care about the athletic events? You could ask, why do the gods care about the war? Why do they care about human beings generally? And that question quickly spirals. It's a fascinating and rich one. I'm not going to get into it now, but I think there's a lot to be said about it. Thanks for the question, Kurt.
Thanks, Noah. And thanks, Kurt, for your question. The next question comes from Jim Rice, and Jim asks, while not directly related to the theme of funeral games, it deals with the reason for having the games. Achilles seems to project his anger on Hector. If he was truly self-aware, he would first have recognized that the death of Patroclus was directly due to Patroclus's, ignoring Achilles's specific instructions on how to conduct himself in battle. He should then reflect on how his permission to use the armor and what it represented was a bad decision in the first place, as it offered a superior threat from a much lesser warrior.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. I mean, my intuition is that Achilles is well aware of all those things. He is wrestling with them, but he's also really angry at Hector. The two are not incompatible. Achilles is angry at himself, angry at his life circumstances, angry at the death of his friend, and angry at Hector. He might also be angry at Nestor for proposing that plan that Patroclus don Achilles' armor in order to go out into battle and fight the Trojans off of the ships. So I think his anger is omnidirectional, but that he has a convenient target for it in the body of Hector. So I'm with you, Jim. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Noah, and thanks, Jim, for your question. The next question, although this is actually an extended comment, but it's asserted so assertorially that you'll be able to agree or disagree. This comes from John Martin, and John writes, funeral games for an attendant, not a king, are surely not customary. The games seem to be Achilles' afterthought. Although everyone does what Achilles tells him, no one speaks to Achilles. Not once, not one word. Menelaus appeals not to Achilles, but to the crowd. They, in another act of independence, go against Achilles and stop the Ajax/Diomedes duel on their own. Otherwise, everyone just obeys Achilles. He calls for the contests. He hands out prizes. The army needs him. They are afraid to disobey, but no one ever thanks him. What he is doing demeans them and is unwelcome. Far from viewing the games as a reconciliation of Achilles with his own side, we must notice the forced frozen quality of the entire situation and realize that the actors, after it is over, are not in harmony, but like each other even less than they did before. Achilles was not wise to let Agamemnon participate, even to throw a spear. Much as they disliked Agamemnon, the army now might feel some sympathy for him and show their disapproval of Achilles' leadership by applauding him. Achilles was wise not to let Agamemnon participate, even to throw a spear. Oh, wait. Oh, I typed that in there twice or pasted it in. So by applauding him. Yep. And well, full stop.
Wow, there's a lot in there. It's really interesting. I disagree with a good deal of it, and I agree with a good deal of it. I'm not sure quite how to respond. I think there's pretty good evidence that undercuts some of those claims, and others I think are really worth exploring. For instance, we really do not hear how the men react to one another during, so we don't know how what the mood of the Greek army is by the end of the games. All we see at the end is Agamemnon gladly accepting first prize and having it be taken back to his tents. I really disagree with the idea that Achilles is forcing the men to participate in something that they have no independent interest in doing. The competitors and the spectators seem really interested in the athletic events. So there is an indication in the text, and I think this might support the larger thought that you're offering, that these games are not expected, right? There's a note from Homer that Achilles holds the armies in place after the barrow has been heaped for Patroclus, and his bones can be collected and entombed in it, at least temporarily. But I don't think that means that Achilles is holding them against their will. I also think it's pretty clear that the disputes that arise are resolved to the satisfaction of the disputing parties. I think that's extremely clear in the case of Menelaus and Antilochus. There are also a few, and likewise, Nestor is very pleased with being awarded an extra prize. And there are another few very clear notes that that anyone who engages in a dispute, although at least some of them, it could be that there's some lasting rancor in some cases, but I think all indications that we have that enable us to say more about this than just what we can say by way of speculation points in the other direction. So thanks for the thoughts, all really interesting. It sounds like you and I would have a lot to talk about this if we could go through the text line by line, but unfortunately I've got the microphone and you've just got your text box, so we're gonna have to leave it there.
Thank you, Noah, and thank you, John, for your question. That is all for the questions. So thank you very much, Noah, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Now, in observance of an ancient custom, at this juncture, I am allowing all participants to unmute themselves so that our speaker, unlike Beethoven, may hear the applause.
Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to learning with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noah.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thanks.
All right, let's cut John in one. Or they're probably. What?
And someone asked, yes, this presentation will appear on YouTube next week on the Graham School YouTube channel. All right, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for doing a great job, Noah, and have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.